So, without further ado, and I hope I pronounced this name correctly, it is a great pleasure to welcome Minke Gloistein GM0HCQ, who has worked for the British Antarctic Survey for over 30 years. Initially sailing as a radio officer until GMDSS came along, and then as a communications officer, and now as an electronics officer on board the RRS Sir David Attenborough. In 2004, Minke was awarded the Polar Medal by Her Majesty the Queen. During this time with the survey, Minke has operated as GM0HCQ/MM, VP8SGK/MM, VP8ROT, VP8SGK, and VP8SIG. So it is a very great pleasure, and thank you very much for joining us, Minke. And with that, I will hand over to you with a very warm welcome from RADARC. Thank you very much.
Hello, and yeah, very good evening, and thank you very much for having me. I mentioned earlier, just before we start, I do have the chat up. So if anybody has a question, then just please fire that through on chat. Can I just get you to confirm that you can just see the PowerPoint display and not the chat and the other things that are on my screen?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, confirmed.
Right, okay, so that's fine. Okay, so anyway, right, so very good evening to you. I've called this talk From Morse Code to the World Wide Web because that's pretty much what it's going to cover, in the changing face of Antarctic communications, which is a sort of based loosely on a talk I did a number of years ago for the RSGB at one of their conventions. So I've been introduced. You've pretty much got all my basic details. That's a much younger, more handsome picture of me. This is in the radio room of the James Clark Ross. Yeah, quite a long time ago, to be honest, with some fairly old scanty gear. We'll talk radio whilst we're there. A lot of my amateur radio work was done using this scanty equipment, which was very, very good. It was a pain from the point of view that if you were scrolling up and down frequencies, then the problem that I would have is it's push button. It's no twiddly dial. So that made it slightly more difficult. It had fairly good filtering. I predominantly operate CW, primarily because it means that as I'm operating, I can drink tea, eat biscuits, read the news, or talk to anybody that's passing through, which frequently happens. It's very rare that I spend time on the radio and somebody hasn't popped in to ask a question when they really should know that they should be leaving me in peace. So yeah, worked for the Antarctic Survey, British Antarctic Survey for 31 years. Started originally on the Bransfield, then moved to the James Clark Ross and the Bransfield, did sort of shot about. Then the Ernest Shackleton replaced the Bransfield, and then moved to the James Clark Ross, I think about 2002 or 2003, and I was there till 2018 when I moved to Liverpool for the build of the Sir David Attenborough, which is our new super duper Antarctic research ship, which as I speak is heading for the equator and is heading south, and I will be joining in the new year. Sadly, I don't think I'll be operating, and if I remember, I'll talk more about that nearer the time. So this is the James Clark Ross, the ship that I've probably spent most of my time on and done most of my operating from. And she's a lovely ship. She's 31 years old now, just been sold to the Ukrainians, and we'll probably see, they'll probably get another 20 years of service out of her if they look after her. A little bit more about the Ukrainians as we go on. I'm not quite sure what happened there. Okay, just to give you, can you see my mouse?
Yes.
Yes, right. Okay, so a bit of perspective. This is the James Clark Ross, okay? So she's 100 meters long, she's 18 meters wide, and this is us. If you see where my mouse is coming from the left in the center, this is the route that we've taken through this pack ice. This pack ice is 9/10, so there is a little bit of gaps, and we were making progress to this point, but they're giant ice flows, as you can see. They're several hundred meters in sort of all directions, and you really need to be able to allow for the ice to move out of the way to break through. We were going to Rothera at the time. The photos taken by one of the aircraft that we had come out to give a recce, and at this point we decided we weren't going to make it, so we turned around and did some other work and went back a month later. These sort of things happen, but it's just to give you an idea of the scale of things when you're working in these areas. So these really are the British presence in Antarctica. We had a lot more presence, but over the years they've closed things down and amalgamated things. So up at the top to the right, you've got South Georgia, which is actually run on behalf of the South Georgia government, but it is a BAS establishment. Then at the western end of South Georgia, literally separated by half a mile of sea, is Bird Island, which is a tiny little base, our smallest fully manned base, anywhere between 3 and 6 people there during the winter. The thing about Bird Island, why it was so precious, was that South Georgia, which was a whaling station, had lots of whaling stations, in fact, during the whaling years, had a lot of rats on the island, which caused problems with bird life. Whereas at Bird Island, that little stretch of water stopped the rats, and they've managed to keep Bird Island rat-free. South Georgia is now rat-free, I hasten to add. So Bird Island was another base. Then moving slightly down to the South Orkney Islands, you've got Sydney base, and then go down the Antarctic Peninsula across to the left, and there is Rothera. And then we've got Fossil Bluff and Sky Blue, which are staging points for our aircraft. And then finally, our furthest south base, which is Halley, which used to be manned. It was put in back in the 50s. I first went when Halley 4 was there. They're on Halley 6 now, but there's a bit of a crack sort of between it and sort of anywhere safe. So it's not permanently manned. There is a team in there as we speak. The summer team are in, and it's actually powered by a small jet engine. There's a little jet turbine that provides the power, a couple of 100 kilowatts, and it works through the winter months, and it still collects science, but it's not actually manned. So I'm going to stick with the James Clerk Ross to start off with, and because you're a radio club, you probably want to see a bit of radio stuff. So this is the old scanty gear being removed. Fantastic equipment, TRP 8757, 750 watts. Typically, I only ever operated on 100 watts because that was more than sufficient. My issue wasn't getting a signal out, it was receiving a signal, because all I had was a vertical antenna. It's a great ground plane, so I tended to do reasonably well. But this is the scanty gear going. When the ship was built, it actually had Marconi gear, which was awful. I can't think of another word to use. It was the worst equipment I've ever sailed with in my life. Albeit the new sailor gear is a bit debatable, but the scanty was definitely my favorite. It was just so nice to use. And this is the radio station with the scanty gear. So you've got over where the mouse is. This is the display. Oh, sorry, not the scanty gear. This is the new sailor gear that went in. So this is the display and the control for the HF side of things. One of the issues was if you went to do a test message by digital selective calling, which is the way we would do a distress message now in GMDSS, invariably the thing would lock up and you have to switch it off and switch it back on again. So I wasn't overly struck on that. There's a amateur set down here, which was a Kenwood TS480. That's what I used because it was just superb. And then a iambic Kia, which is my preferred option through a tuner. I used to use one of the ship's antennas. I used to just patch it in and disconnect the commercial gear. When I started in 1990, it was all Morse code and fax, a little bit of telex, but pretty swiftly we moved and we got our first email system, which we the backbone of that, the computery side of the email system, was bought off the back of a lorry in a pub car park off the, I think it was something like the Anglia Health Board or Water Board. But we have definitely moved away. And now, personally, HF comms we just do not use. If we did do any HF comms, it would likely just be with the aircraft. Whereas when I first started, we used to have 3 skeds during the synoptic hours, which was midday, 1800 and midnight GMT, when we would send the weather initially to Faraday, and then it moved to Rotherham after Faraday was sold to the Ukrainians. So this is the new radio gear going into the Bransfield, and there's a radar set open at the back as well. And again, lots and lots of wiring and what have you. A fairly straightforward job, because much of the coax and that was in place, so we didn't have to do a great deal of replacing. But the Scanty gear definitely was my preferred option. So because it's Antarctic-y based, there's going to be a little bit of wildlife. I suspect you'd be disappointed if there wasn't. It's not all going to be radio. I would like to tell you what sort of seal this is, but I can't because I genuinely do not know. Some of the seals, Weddell seals, and some of the other seals that you get down that neck of the woods, I find very difficult to tell apart. So this is a generic seal. He's just sitting on an ice floe, catching the sun and having a snooze. We see, depends where we go, you see lots of seals. The further south you go, you get things like this. This is a leopard seal. There's a sad story related to leopard seals. The last fatality we had on a British base in Antarctica was, I think, 2004. And one of the scientists was doing some recreational diving. In fact, I think they were just doing some snorkeling and got attacked by a leopard seal, which dragged the person down, I think, to 80 meters because they had a dive watch on. And sadly, they didn't survive. And needless to say, since then, the rules have changed very greatly as to how recreational diving, Rotherham does a lot of diving for science purposes, but they put out special watches and everything. But leopard seals, yeah. But on land, I mean, I've seen penguins walk literally within inches of a leopard seal on land because they're not bothered. It's when they're in the water that they're at their most dangerous. Elephant seals, these are quite large beasts. So you got the male at the back, the female much smaller. The male weighs about 2-3 tons, big beast. The female and then the pup. It looks lovely, and you think there's a lovely family photo. The male actually only has one thing on his mind, and it's got nothing to do with the pup. If the pup gets in the way, the pup will just get flattened. And the female, so the male is keen on mating. He will also guard his beach. You can see he's got lots of scars. That's where he's been fighting with other bull elephants. They are big, although I have to say I'm more comfortable around an elephant seal than I'm a fur seal. Fur seal will tend to go for you. Elephant seals are a bit more relaxed. The first time I went south, I nearly sat on one because they quite often have growth on them, and I just thought it was a mossy bank and I was going to take a seat. And then it did two things. One, it farted, and the other one is it snorted, both of which are very loud. And then I thought, maybe not. But I was a little green behind the ears at the time, and consequently I wasn't fully aware of what I was doing, but you go ashore and you think you know what you're doing. Whereas this cute little baby is a fur seal and easily identified, because I'll just move my mouse. Where's my mouse gone? Because you can just pick out an ear. So the fur seals have got ears. When they're really small, maybe a little bit bigger, they're quite fun and playful and inquisitive. And if they come chasing up to you, you can just go boo, and they'll scamper away. When they get bigger, especially if they're on a beach, and again, if their mating seasons are just sort of around about November, December time, the males will guard the beach, guard the harem, and they will go for you. And the trick is, well, my trick is I get somebody else to stand in front of me with a stick. And what you're supposed to do, I'm reliably informed, but I've never held the stick, is you just tickle their whiskers or tickle them under the chin and they'll back down. I always get somebody else to do that, and I always make sure there is somebody else between me and the fur seal. So a little bit of amateur radio. It doesn't look very exciting, but this is VP8 ROT, which is Rotherham, where I'm have had the pleasure of operating on numerous occasions. The equipment you will see is the Scanty, which I do quite like. Apart from anything else, you can plug a Morse key into it, key, so that's good. This setup is actually in the sort of the lower level of the control tower for the flying. They've up on the control tower, they've got loads and loads of radio kit, but I come down here, wait for them to finish their schedule with the field parties, and then they let me loose for a couple of hours. It's one of the best places I've operated from, primarily because they normally give me a very good antenna, and it's just good. I was working from upstairs on a different set because they've actually got a TS480 there as well, and I was using that using this is a view of Rotherham, by the way, and up to the right, just up here, they've got a rotatable log periodic, and I was using that, which just drags everything in. It's fantastic. But it was sort of pointed at North America, so I'm working lots of Americans who, needless to say, haven't got a clue about Alpha Bravo Charlie and it's Abel Baker Comedian or something. And I don't do very well with Abel Baker Comedian. I just don't understand it because I've been trained in the proper words. And it got to the point where I rarely, and rather as one of the few places where I will use SSB, because I know so many people are keen to work it. And I just sort of stopped, paused, and I just put out a call and said, I am only going to answer stations who are using the correct phonetic alphabet. And just like that, everybody was on the proper phonetic alphabet. And it just goes to show that they can do it if you prompt them. I think one of the best ones, I did hear an American talking to a Russian once, and he was giving his call sign, and he had the letter U for uniforming, and he was giving out his call sign, and he goes, and U, umbrella. And I just thought, you really are having a laugh. You're talking to a Russian who possibly doesn't know what an umbrella is, but there you go. So Rotherham has, just whilst we're on the base, so we've got a wharf down here. This wharf has been greatly increased because our new ship, the David Attenborough, is 30 metres longer than the James Clark Ross. And then there's science buildings. You can just see this is the control tower. So that's where I actually operate from. We've got a runway. We fly 4 Twin Otter aircraft and also a -7. The -7 will go out to blue ice runways and is good for moving heavy bits of kit around. And then the Twin Otters will go deep field to drop people and equipment off. And there is the rather fantastic rotatable log periodic. One of the issues, of course, being in the Antarctic is the weather in the winter gets, well, even in the summer, it can be a little bit bad. And it's not unusual for elements to drop off. They do have 3 or 4 other different types of antenna array, which are fixed in either north, south, or east, west. But when they're working field parties, this is the preferred option. And they still do use HF for field parties, although all field parties will carry an Iridium handset with them, so they can do a little bit of data for sending emails, and if necessary, make a phone call if there's an emergency or if the HF sched doesn't work out. So we'll go back to a little bit of wildlife. James Clark Ross sitting down in the corner there. This is on Bird Island, which it's a lovely place, other than it's a real pain to get to. The boat trip in and out of Bird Island can be interesting, to say. One of the worst boat trips I've ever had was coming out of Bird Island. I genuinely feared for my life and wished I wasn't on it. I've been stuck on Bird Island only for a day because it fogged in. They couldn't come and get me, which was no hardship for me. I was having a great time. So we've got, I think that looks like possibly a light-mantled sooty albatross sitting on a nest. They use fake nests where they can, because they can just plug in a laptop or a Palm device to monitor the growing chick's weight. And you can get very close to them. The bird will not leave the nest. The parents will go off to sea to fish and then come back and feed them. And even if a parent is sitting on the nest, the parent won't come off the nest. You'd have to lift it up. And they are big. When you get to the sort of wandering albatross, size. Both the chicks and the adults are huge. This is a more traditional nest. So the birds nest in tussock grass, and they'll nest quite high up on the cliffs. And sometimes you go up, and if you're lucky enough to be able to do so, which I've done in the past over the years, and you're going through this tussock grass, and you're, well, not miles, but you could be a mile from the beach, and you've still got to watch out for fur seals, because they hide behind the tussock grass with the sole purpose of jumping out, frightening you, and trying to bite your ankles. You do not want to get bitten by a fur seal. They carry all sorts of horrible, nasty diseases in their mouth. And if you do get bitten, you have to go through quite a lot of injections of antibiotics and things. If any of you, no, none of you live in Yorkshire because you're all in Reading. If anybody wants to see a black-browed albatross, you need to go to Bempton Cliffs in Yorkshire, where there is currently a resident black-browed albatross who's got a little bit lost. It's caused a bit of a stir in the birding world, if any of you are birders, but they also are beautiful birds. These and the wandering albatrosses are fantastic to watch if they're flying as a pair, because it's like synchronized swimming. It is just stunning to see. And that's one of the nice things about Bird Island and South Georgia in general, is the wildlife. So this is a wandering albatross, so 9-10 feet wingspan, really, really big birds. And if you're lucky enough to get next to one when it's sat on the nest, they're spectacular. If you get too close, they just sort of clack their beaks, but they're not going to leave the nest. So, you know, but we do have a rule whereby we minimum of 5 meters away from any of the wildlife. However, if the wildlife comes to you and it's less than 5 meters, that's fine. And I'll talk a little bit more about that further down. And then a light mantled sooty albatross, which again is just such a lovely, lovely bird. Don't see so many of those normally, just typically when we're around Bird Island. Wandering albatrosses will follow us as we go south, but you get to a point probably 62 degrees south maybe, and then they just vanish. They don't go further south. They sort of stay within the belt, and as they work their way around the continent. Another favourite place to operate from, and as you'll see, it's got my favourite scanty gear, which I think has now been removed, and they don't have any HF kit. This is King Edward Point on South Georgia, VP8SGK. Not the best antenna arrangement, unfortunately. They had some bother with antennas, but it is a great place to operate from. And in this picture, not only can you see, so you've got the transceiver unit here, or the front end, but this is the gubbins, the actual transceiver, and then this is the power supply unit. It was interesting when we changed on the James Clark Ross from this scanty gear to the sailor gear, the power supplies just shrank. I mean, that's almost a two-man lift, that power supply. Certainly if you're taking off the bulkhead, you want somebody to support it as you undo the last bolt. Whereas the new power supplies are just tiny switch mode power supplies, and they just, completely different game. This gear was very reliable. This so far not had too much trouble with the sailor, other than it sort of hanging up. And for those of you that know a little bit about GMDSS, which is the Global Maritime Distress System, this is a DSC controller, so you would receive DSCs or distresses or messages via that, and you can send as well. It's now all built into the display unit on the sailor gear. So this is another view of South Georgia. The base is actually sitting behind the ship, and we've got two helpful king penguins just getting in the way, really. This is, so the base, which is sort of on that little peninsula at the end, is King Edward Point, but where I'm stood, it's around at a place called Grytviken, and that was one of the many, I think there were 9 whaling stations, one of the whaling stations there. And in fact, I think this bit just over here is a sunken floating dry dock. which got sunk during the conflict in 1982. So there's a lot of whaling paraphernalia around on South Georgia. Many of the buildings have now been dismantled because it's at Grytviken anyway, because they had so much asbestos in them. Whereas a lot of all the other whaling stations are as they were, they're just falling down and dangerous, and you're not allowed into them. I'm very fortunate because I've been around so long. I've actually been ashore and been through most of them. It's quite amazing what you can find. Loads of radio gear kicking around, harpoon heads, just empty boxes saying, you know, Pacific whale meat, and bits and pieces. South Georgia, if you win the lottery and you want to do the holiday of a lifetime and you want to visit Antarctica, get on a cruise that takes you to South Georgia. You will not be disappointed. In my view, it is the most beautiful place on the planet. It is just truly, truly wonderful. These are two of the whaling boats. So these are actual whalers that were left at South Georgia. One's called Petrel, and I can't remember what the other one is. It might be Dion. Now, when I first went south, one of these, the engines used to still work, but as you can see, they've suffered quite badly. And in fact, when I went south, they were still afloat, but they've actually been pulled up onto the beach. And I'm delighted to say that we don't bother with lookout things like this anymore. We've got a very nice conning tower on our new ship, and it's quite comfy and cozy up there. And you can even phone home from the comfort of the crow's nest on our ship. So lots and lots of stuff, loads of whale bones lying around because, you know, that's just the way it was. They just disposed of the whales and then threw everything around. But you're not allowed to take anything away whilst you're there anymore. It's all protected by law. Which sort of conveniently moves us on to whales. And I'm delighted to say that there's been a recent survey and whale numbers have increased dramatically, especially in the vicinity of South Georgia. I mean, for many years, you wouldn't see a whale in Cumberland Bay. Now, Cumberland Bay is where you go into to get into to Grytviken and King Edward Point. But they have actually now sighted humpback whales in there. These are a pair of humpbacks. They're not very far from the ship. And they're probably, though humpbacks and minkes are the ones we see the most. Minkies probably in numbers, you might see a bigger group of minkies. Humpbacks will just be in singles or pairs normally. But it's very rare that you get a trip where you don't see whales. This is down at Rotherham. I'm not too sure what they are. If anybody's a whale expert, feel free, but I can't actually remember. And I ought to. Problem is, I've not been south for 3 years, and I've not kept up with my whale recognition. But this is not unusual. There might be right whales actually. They look fairly long. So yeah, we're very, very fortunate that we do get to see lots of interesting wildlife, which for me is what makes the job very interesting. Just down in the bottom left-hand corner, we'll see the next shot will show you. That's the ship. We have in the past had to stop science because the whale has literally been in the way of where we're trying to deploy the instrument. Humpbacks, they are the most inquisitive and will spend time. You know, you can have a humpback with you for 3 or 4 hours. So if somebody says, oh, there's a humpback, you don't necessarily have to rush because you're worried about missing it. Killer whale, yeah, once you've seen it, it's probably gone. And there are other whales that we do see. I've never seen a blue whale down south. I've seen one up in the Arctic. But southern rights are fairly common. That's the second largest of the species. So yeah, whales are good. Minke whales, these are the baby whales really. These are quite small. And this picture just sort of shows the blow. If you get a big whale, a southern right whale is a classic one. If it's close enough and it blows, not only can you hear it clearly, but you can almost feel it in the air if it's by the side of the ship. Quite often you'll hear a whale before you see it. You know, you could just, if you look in the wrong direction, you will hear a blow and then you turn and then that's how you spot the whale. And this, of course, is where the term "there she blows," because that's how the whalers back in the day actually sighted a whale. You'll see a whale, well, you won't see a whale. You'll see where a whale is at 3, 4, 5 miles from its blow before you actually see the whale itself. One of the drawbacks, of course, is that it does sort of bugger up science, because if you get a whale that's playing beside the ship, everybody rushes out to take pictures, and they are just fascinating things to watch. Sometimes, if you're lucky, they'll roll over and do bits and pieces. Other times they just swim around. And I say during the course of a day, you know, if you've got a couple of humps, they will stay with you. I was down the South Orkneys one year, and we were doing a bit of krill science, and it was early in the new year, because they knew that's when the swarms of krill were going to be. And literally every time I walked onto the bridge for the whole week, if you didn't see 10 or 12 or 20 blows every time you were on the bridge, and they were southern right whales, it was, you know, you're in a bad moment. Just the number of whales was phenomenal. And this is one of my more unusual pictures. It was a beautiful day, it has to be said. It was flat calm, and all I did was I knew the whales were there. It's a minke whale, and I stepped outside and I looked. So I'm 45, 50 feet above sea level, and I looked straight down into a beautiful calm sea. And this whale was probably 3, 5, 8 meters below the surface. Unfortunately, I didn't quite get all of it in, but I'm still happy with the result. So yeah, it's the trick really is always have your camera ready, because otherwise you'll miss things. The new ship, unfortunately, is a bit more difficult because my office is 2 decks down from the bridge. I am more easily contacted, so I will probably leave my camera on the bridge along with my binoculars, and then if somebody calls, I can just run up the stairs, depending on where I am, of course, to the bridge to hopefully take some pictures. Now, you might notice there's a bit of a theme going on here, because you will see in front of you more scanty radio equipment. So the scanty gear here is the slightly older scanty gear. So this was installed in the early 90s by GAV GM0HCQ, who also installed the scanty gear at Rothera several years later. And this is the Nadsky base, which used to be Faraday, which was VP8FAR. GAV operated as VP8GAV from here. And it's just a lovely little base. It's halfway down the Antarctic Peninsula. It's maybe a couple of 100 miles north of Rothera. So we sold it to the Ukrainians in '96 for £1, which was a good deal for them, but it was also a very good deal for us, because under the rules of the Antarctic Treaty, anything that you're no longer using, you have to remove. And that includes bases, which will be interesting with Halley, because Halley is, say, sat on the wrong side of a crack, and we may well have to take it out. And logistically, that's going to be difficult, I think. But to remove a base like Faraday would, you know, in '96 would have cost probably over £1 million. So selling it for £1 was a bargain, I feel. The Ukrainians have looked after it superbly. They've added a few new buildings, including a small chapel, which is absolutely gorgeous. But the base is spotless. So when you arrive, this is the view you get. You get a nice big thumbs up and a welcome. The bus stop sign, there's a lot of things that are actually on the base that are still British, including some of the science equipment that they in effect maintain for us. There's a tide gauge there, which we go in and we pick up the data from every year. That's the Proudman Oceanographic Institute up in Liverpool. I don't know whether they're called that, but that's what they used to be. So there's various bits and pieces that go on. So yes, they have maintained the base extremely well. However, before they got the base, many years ago, there were a couple of carpenters, a couple of chippies, I think 3 chippies went in. They were given lots of nice wood to do lots and lots of jobs around the base. They did actually, I think, get the sack at the end of the day, because what they actually did for the entire winter months was they built what is deemed to be the best bar in the Antarctic. So the Ukrainians have embraced this, but they have also added the tradition that any visiting women, not sure it's politically correct, but it's the way it is, any visiting women are to leave their bra behind. Typically, because we know this, what happens if any of the girls are going ashore, they just bring a spare bra with them. So you'll see that the bar is festooned with bras. Very, very welcoming. And say they have now purchased the James Clark Ross. They've just renamed it the Noosa or something. I can't actually remember what it is. But the name links it to Vanadski, the name Vanadski as well. I'm not sure if it's going to be sailing south this year because it's been bought by a bunch of scientists that don't know anything about ships. So they might need to do a few bits and pieces before they can actually take it anywhere. However, it will be going south again, and it will offer much, much better support to the Ukrainians, who, when they first bought the base, they relied on the passenger ships going in and out to get the staff in. I'm not quite sure how they managed with the fuel and that. They might have relied on some Russians. But yeah, it remains a superb place. So we see penguins quite a lot. So these are king penguins, which are the second largest penguins that you find. If you go, I don't know what's your nearest zoo to Reading, but any zoos you go to that have penguins, the chances are the penguins have been originally brought back by the whaling companies. And in fact, there are still some companies that do occasionally bring penguins back. We never bring penguins back. You get them in the Falklands. Emperor penguins, king penguins are found in the Falklands and sub-Antarctic areas, South Georgia, but any further south, you probably won't find the kings. They have big colonies quite often, tens of thousands. There's some very famous colonies on South Georgia, which even if you're at anchor and you're 5 miles off, you can smell them, because if there's one thing you can say about a penguin is that it does pong a bit. So we have this 5 meter rule, and I'm blatantly not 5 meters from these penguins. In this particular instance, they've just wandered across because they are quite inquisitive. Although at South Georgia, and certainly at King Edward Point, they are used to people because they get a lot of tourists in at KP in South Georgia. And obviously the scientists are there all year round. But they are still quite curious and not too afraid of people. There you go. So they just, huddle up on you. But the bigger issue is, which hopefully is the next slide. No, that's a Gen 2 penguin with a seal in the background. Gen 2s don't very often see them in South Georgia, actually. I tend to find them a little bit further south. Emperor penguin. So these are the biggest of penguins. They look very much like a king. I don't know if there are any emperors in captivity, possibly in Japan, but they're not easy birds to look after. These are the birds from Happy Feet that breed literally on the sea ice. So they need the sea ice to form, is the first thing, which tends not to be an issue. The bigger problem is that once they've laid their eggs, they've incubated their eggs, and then the summer comes, so the parents then take turns to go and collect food. The sea ice, as the summer increases, erodes away. And I have seen, and it's a horrible thing, really. If you get some bad storms, it breaks the ice up, and you see clumps of emperor penguin chicks. They can't go in the water, because if they go in the water, they'll drown because they've still got their down. They haven't formed their feathers. So they're doomed to die. They'll either fall in the water and drown, or they'll get predated upon by killer whales and the like. Penguins that you definitely want to avoid, so I'm keeping a distance from this one using a zoom lens, is when they're molting. The reason being is that when they molt, it takes a period of time, and during that time, they have to conserve energy because they can't feed, they can't go into the sea to feed, so they just stand and look very sorry for themselves. So we're very, very careful about, we don't even want them to get to the stage where they even have to flap a flipper, because that's a waste of their energy, and they're just going to stand there and let nature take its course and go through the molt. So we sort of come to the World Wide Web. Through the years, when I first went south, I didn't have a laptop. It was a telex machine and a typewriter. I used to type up typically half a page of A4, which I would fax through to the office. If that wouldn't work, then we could telex it. This was using Inmarsat B. If I wanted to phone home, it would cost £6.10 per minute using the satellite system. HF was probably about half the, I can't actually remember. HF was always calculated in gold francs, which is some obscure currency that the maritime world uses from a communications accounting point of view. And then, 10 years or so ago, we finally moved into the world of full-on satellite communications. Inmarsat used to give us initially fax and telephone. They do data, but it's quite expensive. So we moved to a C-band system. You get KU band, which has issues, whereas the C-band is better for us. And being C-band, you need a huge dish. So this was a good one for a party. In fact, I have a feeling that the dome on the Sir David Attenborough is actually bigger than this, ever so slightly. There's lots and lots of space. The base of it's taken up with a huge air conditioning unit. I'm not quite sure why I've got an air conditioning unit. We managed in the past without. So basically in here, so you've got the dish at the top. Then there's the transceiver unit, which is actually this unit. There's a multiplexer. Then there's down here, there's a sort of a gyro system, control box, all sorts of bits and pieces, which I would go up and sort of look at and make sure nothing had fallen off. Generally speaking, very reliable. In all the years that I've sailed with these, I've had to change transceiver unit once, I think, and one power supply. Very, very reliable kit. So with this, we would get, I think we had a sort of 2 megabit per second internet link, which was used for internet and for email. In addition to that, we had a telephony VoIP system, but we also had a sort of a bit of a hodgepodge analog system, which had 4 telephone lines. And when we had that, we could phone home for literally pennies. You would just buy a bog standard calling card. All the calls came generated from Cambridge, and then the link between Cambridge and the ship, the trunk was paid for by Bass, and that just got incorporated. And my wife, in effect, could phone me for free because we have an all-inclusive telephone system, 3 minutes. So she would just dial a Cambridge number 01223, and then that would come through. We're not sure whether it's a good thing to be able to communicate so well. Back in the day when I first started, we were allowed to send 500 words a month by fax, and you just kept everything short and sweet. Whereas now something goes, my wife will phone me and say, whether she's at work or at home, oh, something's not working. How do I fix it? Whereas in the old days, she'd have to work it out to fix it herself. So yeah, it's a debatable point whether there's advantages to it or not. But it certainly makes life a lot easier. And in fact, now on the Sir David Attenborough, we have a TV system, which I think is probably about to stop working because it only works in the Northern Hemisphere. But we are going to upgrade again to a C-band system, and we reckon we will get live BBC One, 2, ITV and Channel 4 as far south as Rotherham. And that's using the British Forces broadcasting system because they broadcast worldwide. So we just tap into that for a fee, which makes life at sea a lot more bearable. There were some people who were going, oh no, we don't want televisions in cabins, it will spoil the social life. In all honesty, is there a social life? When we're doing science, I think the answer to that is there isn't, because everybody's on shifts, everybody's working. There's very few people around all at the same time, so you can't have a get together in the bar to the same extent as we used to do in the old days. There might be 2 or 3 people sort of free at any one time. There's always somebody sleeping. then you've got to eat, you've got to do your washing and all this malarkey. I hasten to add, on the subject of washing, one of my roles is I look after the laundries, of which we have a number. I think we've got now 13 washing machines and tumble dryers that I'm responsible for. I look after everything in the galley. So it's quite a change from just looking after the radio and the radar kit. I obviously do all the navigational kit on the bridge. Touch wood, that seems to be behaving itself at the moment. Working in the Antarctic, of course, means you do get to see some lovely things. Never tire. Any free time that I have, if I'm not playing on the radio, will be spent looking out the window, because you just never know what you're going to see. You're always looking for whales, as I say, but you do get beautiful reflections and stunning views. And these are just a few. This is down the peninsula. Icebergs. They say the Titanic hit an iceberg. I suspect it probably, if it was an iceberg, it was a very, very small iceberg. It's probably a large bergy bit. Icebergs do come in various shapes and sizes. Biggest iceberg I've seen was, I think, about, well, I lie, I didn't see it. It was about 25 miles long, and we sort of followed it down, but we couldn't see it because it was pitch black, and we just had it on the radar. I have seen bergs that are like 15 miles long and 5 miles wide. They tend not to be an issue because they're big. The things that we are more worried about is all the stuff that we've got in the front here, these bergy bits, which might be the size of a car or a bus or something similar. We used to joke to people that have never been south before, you get lovely caves form in icebergs, and we used to always say that's where the whales go to have their babies. Some people do believe that. It's amazing what you can get away with. So what we've got here, we've got an iceberg in the background, and then this is sea ice. It's not actually a berg, this is sea ice, that's frozen ice, probably a couple of years old because it looks quite thick. So a little bit more sea ice. For those of you that are eagle-eyed, there's a seal parked on that one. There's a seal parked over there. This ice probably 1 to 2 meters thick, I'd guess. We'll go through that without too much trouble, because when we hit it, it will split, and there is space. So you've got these big areas here for it to move to. The problem we have is if there is nowhere for it to go, i.e. you're in 10 tenths pack, then you can try as much as you want. Right, I've just seen a question here. Do you get new graduates? How do millennials take? Oh yeah, how do millennials? Yeah, millennials don't like us. New graduates, good question. Even if they're not graduates, we get undergraduates, because the thing you got to remember about graduates and the like is that they're, for want of a better word, cheap labour. So we quite often get people who are in effect still studying at university, whether they're in postdocs or whatever, and they'll come on board because it's good experience, but it's very, very cheap, because whoever they're working for doesn't actually have to pay them, which I know sounds wrong, but that's just the way it goes. And the other thing I will say is my personal view is we now get far more women coming south than we do men. Men are becoming, I think, you're seeing less of them. We're seeing more women in the senior roles as well as principal scientists. How do they take life in the environment? I think your comment there is probably referring to communications. Communications are good. They're getting better. I think our link now is about, it's supposed to be 3 megabits per second. I've seen it running about 5. We keep tweaking it to try to get the best out of it. One of the things that they do allow is WhatsApp. So when I was last on the JCR, you get people come on board, and I'd give a little speak, and I'd say, you know, there is no Wi-Fi internet. You know, if you want to use, you have to plug in on your laptop. Don't use heavy, you know, you can't stream things. You can't go to Netflix. You can't use Skype, things like this. And then somebody go, oh, I've got Wi-Fi, it's all right. And you just think, shall I tell them, yes, they got Wi-Fi, but that just gives them access to the local network and nothing outside. Now, When I was last on board, there was full access, but we're trialing a system so everybody have full access. The drawback with that is that when everybody comes on board with their phones, their iPads, or their whatever the devices they have, every single one of those will be connected to the internet. And of course, every single one of those thinks it's got the right to download the entire internet just to keep up to date. So there are issues with that. But WhatsApp is something that we try to promote because it means you can be instantly contactable. We don't allow video and we don't allow pictures. Email, that's been going for donkey's years now, and you can sort of send stuff. As you will see later on, I'm quite keen on Twitter, and yes, it is tempting to send a picture, and we've got no objections. Everybody sends pictures. I send lots of pictures, normally on Twitter or Facebook. But the trick is that when you take a picture and it's 7 megabytes, you reduce that to 120 or 150 kilobytes. There was a scientist who was at Rotherham one year who left and sent a picture of them dressed in a chicken suit. It was a 6 megabit picture. They sent it as a BASL, so it went to every single BAS address. So just on the ship, it would have downloaded as an individual file, probably 60 plus times. If I could have got my hands on that person, I would have been giving them a serious talking to. So we do try not to send large files. Because bandwidth is restricted, and the game changer, without a shadow of a doubt, is going to be when I think one is Weibo and then the other one is Starlink. When that is available pole to pole, and we can just from one dish get 100, 150 megabit link, well, you just stick 2 or 3 dishes on, and then everybody can stream Netflix. Will that discourage socializing? I don't know, but it will be a game changer. I've got a feeling that might be after I've gone, sadly, because it would be nice to be able to go down and actually do some decent live streaming and things. But who knows? Anyway, so yeah, bit of pack ice there. If you do take my advice and you spend all your pension money that you've accumulated over all the years you've worked and you book a holiday to the Antarctic, the bad news is you will probably only be going for about 7 to 10 days, and it will cost an arm and a leg. In those 7 to 10 days, you might just get 7 to 10 days of really, really crap weather. But my view is, even in the bad weather, it is, other than the fact that you're probably going to be as sick as a pig, if you can get outside and stand up straight, it will still be stunning. And there's a lot to be said for being in a blow in the Antarctic. It is interesting. There are times when I can honestly say I have seriously considered stacking shelves in Tesco's as another option, because it's not, I don't tend to, I have been chronically seasick. James Clark Ross wasn't too bad. My cabin on the JCR was the highest cabin on the ship because of the rules of when the ship was built. The radio officer had to be within 15 seconds or something of the radio room. So I was on bridge deck. Everybody else was below me. And when the ship was rolling more than 25, 30 degrees, you couldn't sleep because you just slid up and down your bunk, which was horrendous. So I would just be tired and grumpy. And typically what you do, if the situation's that bad, or you can't sit at your desk because your monitor is bouncing so much you can't read anything on it, you would just go and have a lie down or a cup of coffee or a tea or whatever. And then when you felt that you were in a position to maybe do 5 minutes work, you would go off and do 5 minutes work, unless something broke and it had to be fixed, in which case you didn't have any choice. You just had to grin and bear it. So yeah, even in bad weather, you can still, and this is only murky weather rather than bad weather. So we've got icebergs across, sort of here to the left. We've got pack ice. There is a bit of water in between. When you get 10 tenths pack, and it's just a field of white, you literally can almost feel landlocked. But you could potentially have 5,000 or 6,000 meters of water beneath you. So, it's it is quite unnerving when you think how deep the water is below you. I'll talk about science in a minute. These ice flows are big enough that you could get on, but you would be very careful in doing so, and you would never, ever, you're a foolish man. If you go on YouTube, Google climbing an iceberg or something, and you will see people being very, very stupid. Icebergs are not stable. And in fact, although it's a bit far away, if you look at this iceberg, see how it's nicely curved. The reason it's nicely curved is that used to be under the water at one point. And then, of course, it wears away and its center of balance changes. And without any notice, it will just start to rock and then turn, and you can get caught out. And I have seen videos of people getting caught out. Iceberg and sea ice. And this is late in the season. I know it's late in the season because what we've got here is raft ice. You start off with pancake ice, and this is the sea freezing. Sea freeze is about -2.1, I think. So you start with pancake ice, and it literally is called pancake ice because it looks like pancakes. But then as it sort of gets bigger, it turns into rafts, and then you get sea ice. And needless to say, this A, you wouldn't be able to stand on it, and B, that's not a hindrance to us at all. Just lovely reflections, nice reflections here. Again, it's probably a couple of meters thick. When we crunch through it and you see it roll over you, then you can tell exactly how thick it is. The ice in the Arctic, for those that are interested, is actually tougher. We've caused more damage to the ship by crunching ice up north. Not quite sure why that is. There's some technical reason for it, I'm sure. But yeah, northern ice is definitely a harder thing. Oh, there we go. So there's that. Almost looks like you're on land, but it's not. You know, there's say thousands of meters of water below you. And when you're in a situation like this, do we ever get stuck? Well, yes is the answer. Not a word we like to use. Stuck isn't our favourite term. We get stopped, typically going to Halley when we're down in the Weddell Sea, because they tend to go in November time. So there's still an awful lot of ice in the Weddell. It hasn't broken up and shifted. The longest I've been stopped is possibly 2 weeks. Every now and again, the captain will make a half-hearted effort to make progress, and he might manage to get a couple of 100 meters. And then, because the thing about pack ice is it's not stationary, it's always moving. And this is a problem when we're doing science. You've got a package in the water and we're stationary, and all this ice is whizzing past you at sort of half or a knot, depending on the tides and the current. So yeah, a couple of weeks stopped, and typically you just get on with jobs that you wouldn't normally be able to do if you're a deck officer, because you have to maintain a safe navigational watch. They'll just get a jigsaw puzzle out or two and do bits and pieces. Wildlife is definitely the thing I've missed in the last 3 years. In fact, I've sort of rekindled my love of wildlife in the UK, which I'd sort of moved away from. In fact, this morning I was out doing some serious twitching. In the UK, generally speaking, I've got no idea what I'm looking at. I'm a colourblind electronics officer, I hasten to add, which makes things sort of entertaining in bird spotting. But here we've got a couple of terns just doing a feed. This is in South Georgia. I just quite like it as a picture. So we're going to talk about science. So I've moved away. This is the James Clark Ross. I've moved from the James Clark Ross and now to the Sir David Attenborough, which is our only polar research ship. A long time in the making, but we finally got there. She's not doing any science this year because this is really a trial run south. Science comes in many fashions, and both the Sir David Attenborough and the James Clark Ross aren't, generally speaking, built for a specific piece of science, possibly with the exception of this. This is a CTD, which is a conductivity, temperature and depth sensor. There's bottles, which I think are probably 20 or 25 litre bottles. There's funny little stoppers at the top and the bottom. When we deploy it, these stoppers are out. So as it goes down through the water column, the water flows through. We always check before we deploy it. So we dip it in the water and then we pop it back up to make sure that the top stoppers are all open. If the two stoppers, top and bottom, close, when it gets down to probably just even 100 meters, the pressure is sufficient that it will cause the bottle to implode, which will probably take out bottles on either side of it. So we always double check that that's not going to happen. So then we'll lower that package to whatever depth the scientists want to go to. That could be 5,500 meters. It might just be 200 meters. So you lower it all the way down. There's a package of sensors on the bottom as well, which do all sorts of things. They check sort of a live reading of salinity and the temperature and bits and pieces. So when they get to depth, we then stop for a moment, and then they start coming up, and then the scientists who are in the control room will say, at X number of meters, stop and take a sample. So at that depth, we stop the lift, and then they press a button, send a command. There's a communications cable running down the wire, and then the bottle will close. So when it comes back on board, the scientists then know which bottle has what sample of water from what depth. And the first thing they always test for is the salinity. Now, I'm amazed because we've done, must be tens of thousands of CTDs, and they still don't know the salinity of seawater. And it obviously does change depending on where you're doing it as well. So that is probably one of the things we, is a trade piece of kit for us. Otherwise, the scientists will bring all their equipment with them, and we will then deploy it. Shackleton's book is answering to David there. Yeah, Shackleton is a good book. I like, quite keen on Shackleton. I used to be, just wandering off on a side note there. I was never sure that I was a fan of Scott, but then I read a very good book by Ralph Fiennes, and I'm slightly better inclined to Scott. I think he got some bad press. So Clements Markham, though, who was in charge of the Geographical Society that organised these trips, he was a firm believer that the only people that could operate in the Antarctic were the military, which of course isn't the case. There was the Scottish National Antarctic Expedition, which was by William Spears Bruce, who was a very good scientist and did a lot, but was based in Scotland. He actually has the longest running, his base he set up on Coldest in the South Orkney Islands, and they have the longest running set of data. But Spears Bruce wrote to Clements Markham, after their first winter and said, look, I need a bit of help financially. And Clements Markham said, no, tough luck, mate. Probably because A, they were Scottish, and B, they weren't military. And so Clements Markham contacted the Argentinians, and the Argentinians had a base there ever since. That was about 1903, I think. And that is the longest data set of weather reports, plus other stuff they do there. And they're a very hospitable bunch of people, very nice. So here, moving back to the science on board the ship. So this is what we call a mooring. So there's various sensors. And in fact, if you look at the bottom, this is a very clever system. These are water sample bottles, and we'll deploy this. The last thing, so they stream out a whole number of sensors, which could be on 1,000 meters of wire. And then the last thing that they put in is these train wheels. I kid you not, they are old used train wheels that are no use, big metal weights. So they go in last, which drags the whole thing down to the seabed. But all the instruments are interspersed with buoys, adding buoyancy, so they hang vertically in the water column. And what will happen is, in 1 or 2 years' time, we'll come back, and then we can release the system. We send an acoustic signal down to it. It releases a fuse, and then the whole thing floats to the surface, and we retrieve it. And this is a good one, because these water bottles, every month or so, a command is sent, and it swaps bottles, so they can get a year's worth of data of water samples from a known depth. As you can see, all the people that are working on deck are all very securely tied on. They can't fall over the edge. They can get very close to the edge, but they can't fall over. So this is one of the many things that we will deploy from the back end of the ship. Slightly different moorings here. These sit on the seabed, and they've got acoustic devices which ping up. One of the things that they do is they look at tidal events. Even at depth, they can work out the tide. So again, we just chuck them in the water. These ones are a little bit easier to find because you know when they've popped up because they've actually got a VHF tracker on board. That will only burst into life once the things sort of at sea level. And sorry, is that feedback? Then we know it's surfaced because we can hear it on our VHF-DF. But the other way we can find things when they pop up is they attract the bird life. So you just look for a big back gathering of birds and you will invariably find what you're looking for. So this is a deployment. So we just sort of hang it over the edge. Very simple. It's on a strop. So once it's in the water and it's sitting comfortably, they just pull this wooden peg and then it will just slowly sink to the bottom. They do communicate with it on the way down. And then once it's at the bottom, using acoustic pings, they triangulate it and they get a very accurate position of where it is. And here is the man doing the acoustic pings. So this is an acoustic system. So he listens to it, he pings to it, and will send the recover signal. And this is in the underway instrument control room on the James Clark Ross. So there's lots of scientists in here normally. This actually is our IT guru. We'd be lost without him. Visiting scientist or technician monitoring the equipment.
How do you manage battery supplies at low temperatures?
There's a good question.
Graham, 3XYX, by the way.
Yeah, hello, Graham. That's a very, very interesting question. I think the simple answer to that is they just put lots of batteries in. I don't get involved in that side of thing. A lot of these instruments were literally using Duracell C cells, hundreds of them. Now they're moving to rechargeable lithiums because it's more environmentally friendly. The temperature down there will be a constant, so that's something that they do know. So you've not got a variation in temperature, and that is probably, and certainly at depth, it will be above zero. So we're not talking, yes, it's not warm, but it's not freezing. So it's not as if, the bigger issue is when you're deploying equipment that's on what we call the Bondu, i.e. in deep Antarctica, where the temperature will go down to say -50. That is a bigger problem. And I know that at some of our remote sites, what they actually do is they line, so they'll put a hut in and they'll line the hut with canisters of water, which of course then freeze, but then that helps moderate the temperature within the center of the building. So there's, they seem to manage. I mean, some of these things, the previous, if we go back to, so these things, what they can actually do is they can release individual pods on some of the bigger ones, which means that some of the pods could be down for 4 years and we still get them back. So there is a longevity of life there, certainly. This is just us doing some trawling. So we'll drag this across the seabed and just see what beasties from the deep we can drag up. Sadly, when they're doing this sort of work, the weather's normally crap. So, you know, you've got to be well wrapped up. On the Sir David Attenborough, we'll see there's a picture a little bit later on, they have a fully enclosed hangar, which means when they're doing CTD work, they can bring it inside. I'm going to say into the warm, but that's not necessarily, they might say, no, we don't want the heating on, primarily because that will affect the temperature, even short term, of the water sample. So they want the water sample out as quickly as possible into cold storage. Oh, now, you don't see many of them in the Antarctic as a rule. We're a polar research organisation. We've had a spot in the Arctic at a place called Ny-Ålesund on Spitsbergen for 40, I think it's just celebrated its 40th year. It's a big collaboration at Ny-Ålesund. It is purely a scientific base. When you go there, they actually quite insist that you turn all electrical devices off, all Wi-Fi systems off, because electrically it's a very quiet place and they do some very fancy stuff up there. So we go up to the Arctic, and then if you're going up into the Arctic ice, you do see polar bears. See lots of polar bears in actual fact, which are Wonderful, wonderful line. So yeah, so once you've spent all your retirement money on going to the Antarctic, if you've got anything left, get a Hurtigruten trip with Joanna Lumley up into the Arctic, because it's well worth it. So yeah, we do spend time up there. We do various bits and pieces, and Spitsbergen is a superb place to visit. So everything has to move on. I've had to move away from Morse code to the wonderful digital age, and this is what we've now moved on to. So this is the Royal Research Ship Sir David Attenborough, and she is 100 and, well, I'm going to say 130. She's 129 meters, 26 meters wide, 24, 26. She's wide, she's long, she's very big. And there are lots and lots of stairs. I mean, she is huge in comparison to what I've sailed on previously. The James Clark Ross, we'll see a picture with the two of them almost side by side in a minute. This, oh, where's my mouse gone? That is where my cabin is currently on this ship. That overlooks the bridge of the James Clark Ross, so I'm actually 2 decks down from the bridge on here. Yeah, she's just, everything about her is big. So we've got garage doors here into the science lab. We've got gantries to go over the side. We have a dedicated CTD gantry out of this garage door. Then we've got a stern gantry, and probably the best thing we've got is a 50-ton crane. On the James Clark Ross, the forward crane was 20 tons, which was good, and the after crane was only 10 tons, which wasn't good because you couldn't really lift any of the heavy gear on and off the ship. It proved a problem. Right, what evidence of global warming? Well, that's an interesting. I'm not a scientist. That's the first thing you need to know. I suspect I have seen signs of global warming. There are places that I go that you see more rock, certainly down the top end of the Antarctic Peninsula. However, you've sort of got to weigh that up again. Sydney is a good example of how you've got to be very careful about what you say with regards to global warming. As in, some years you can go to Sydney. So Sydney's the South Orkney Islands. It's about 60 degrees south. It's what we call the banana belt. Technically speaking, it's Antarctica, but true Antarctica is 67 degrees south. Some years we'll go there and we turn up and we park the ship, or we anchor the ship because we can't get alongside, just off the bay, and we run the boats in and we open up the base. It's a summer only base now. Other years we turn up and we can't run the boats because there's so much sea ice. So we have to do a sea ice relief where we need to use a skidoo and haul sledges. Other years we turn up and there's no sea ice, but the base is buried under 10 foot of snow. You've got to dig it out. It just varies so much. The coldest I've ever been in the Antarctic was just to the south of Sydney. It was -27. Typically, I get upset if it gets below about -5, truth be told, because we're down there in the summer months. But I do think, well, I mean, I do know there is global warming because I'm not, I understand the science. I speak to a lot of scientists and I believe what they say. So I have no doubt that there is an issue. One of the places that we're looking, in fact, I'll be going to, where I've never been before, is the Thwaites Glacier, where there's a big American, United Kingdom research project going on. And that's studying that. Pine Island Glacier is a place where I have been and is of major concern, because if that wanders off into the Ogden, then there's going to be all sorts of problems because it's a huge, huge volume of ice. So I'm not prepared to say that I can categorically say there is global warming, but based on the science that I have seen, I am happy to say that yes, there is global warming and that we really should be taking heed. The next thing is, of course, should we be taking a ship which has got 15 megawatts of power in its diesel engines down to the Antarctic, burning fuel in the Antarctic, operating bases in the Antarctic? Well, I think the answer to that is yes, because two reasons. One is it pays me, and the other one is that if we don't go there, then we will miss the signs. A good example of, well, is it global warming? Possibly. Well, it could have been the CFC situation with the ozone layer, which was discovered by the British Antarctic Survey, John Farmer, John Shanklin, not quite sure, there were three guys using a Dobson spectrometer, using manual calculations. The Americans had a satellite up that was also monitoring the ozone layer, but they actually set parameters on the data that it sent. So every time this ozone layer depleted, they just assumed it was duff data. But because our guys were doing it by hand, they managed to publish first and say there's a problem. And the world did actually take heed, and probably for the first time ever, very, very rapidly did something about it. So, you know, the banning of CFCs, funnily enough, I saw a program the other day about Eastern European countries selling banned CFCs and, you know, illegally sending them into the UK for use on some dodgy fridges and what have you. But CFCs are not good. So yes, the work that we do does contribute greatly, and in more ways than just saying the ice caps are melting. I mean, we look at the effect on things like krill, which is the smallest, almost the smallest of the smallest things. But krill is pretty much the bottom of the food chain. The krill is eaten by the penguins, the krill is eaten by the seals, the krill is eaten by the whales. It just works its way up. It supports so much life. Yes, my favorite band probably is well, the last time I was down there operating, it used to be really good. I used to quite like 18 megs, but 18 or 10s are my preferred option. Two reasons for that is they are CW only, and yeah, but I will work on any band given the choice. I don't operate SSB on the TS, the Kenwood set, mainly because I can't find a microphone, or I've probably not looked hard. Aurora Australis, I'll come back to that one in just a second. So sticking with the global warming briefly, yeah, I think we should all be worried and doing something. Unfortunately, I don't know what the correct thing to do is. The Aurora Australis a problem for HF? Yes, I suspect it is. Unfortunately, I've only ever seen the Aurora Australis once from afar, and that's really because I'm only down there in the summer months. So it's, you know, it's normally 24 hours of daylight, whereas the auroras tend to occur more in the winter months. Halley was an interesting one because it went there a lot on the Bransfield, and we would tie up to the ice shelf, and we had this amongst the radio ops, and we used to always refer to it as polar cap absorption. So HF comms could be appalling. I mean, I remember tying up when we were there for a considerable, probably a couple of months, and I couldn't, I mean, literally, I mean, I was thinking my gear's crap, it's, you know, got problems. And then we sailed, and we couldn't have got further than maybe 300 or 400 meters off the ice cap. And it was like somebody flicked a switch and HF just opened. It was incredible. Previously, I mean, you know, it was a bit iffy from time to time. So yes, I think there probably are issues. Does it help or not? I don't know. So I've never wintered in the Antarctic, so I'm not probably the best person to answer that one. We do have a Rolls-Royce steering wheel though, which is probably one of the, and you can't, oh, actually, maybe you can see it, sorry, because I've got the, no, I can use, I don't know whether you can see the chair might also have Rolls-Royce in there, I can't remember. So the ship was designed by Rolls-Royce. They drew up everything. We're sort of based loosely on a few standard sort of ships, but heavily modified. We are probably one of the most complex, well, without a shadow of doubt, we're the most complex ship that Camel Laird have ever built. They did struggle But you didn't have the Spirit of Ecstasy in the front, though. No. Camel Lead, I think, did struggle, and there were issues. Generally speaking, everything's gone well. COVID, of course, didn't help. That really did put the mockers on things for a period of time. But we think we've got a fairly good ship now. We deal heavily with Rolls-Royce, who have sold out part of their division to Kongsberg, which is another big maritime organisation on the electronic side. But the scary thing is that everything you can see there, I'm responsible for. And typically a lot of it, I need to make a phone call to a man in Norway who then has to remotely log in. This is going to be interesting when we're down south, has to remotely log in and fix it, because the skills, this even goes to the extent that if the captain's phone breaks, if he's had a bad day and he's thrown his phone at the bulkhead, which I'm pleased to say I've never had happen yet, but for argument's sake, he did that. It's an IP phone. You think, oh yeah, just plug in a new one. No, I have to speak to a man in Norway who has to configure it remotely. It's not something that can be done on board. That is just the way the modern world works. And for many years, we've struggled because the modern world has assumed that everybody's got high-speed internet and that you're connected to the cloud and what have you, and we're not. And so it will be interesting, and there are things that we will struggle to do. It's not even as if we can go to the local port. The Falklands is where we will normally park when we're down south, because their internet is not much better than ours, so they're not going to be able to offer, or if they did offer us anything, it would probably cost tens of thousands of pounds. And then there's South America. Really what we need to do is we need to get a fibre optic link into the Falklands. That will be a game changer. The Falklands is, I think, the only place in the world, and I've been to a lot of places in the world that I've been to, where you cannot get free internet. It just does not exist. You have to pay for the internet there. And their internet is via a satellite link as well. Right. Oh, sorry. So I thought the James Clark Ross, which is on your left, was a fairly big ship. I sailed on her for 20-something years, and she was a good ship in sea. And then we turned up on the SDA, and I looked across and I thought, wow, there is just no comparison. I can tell you it's 101 steps from the control room on the Sir David Attenborough, so that's where the engineers sit, up to the bridge, and it's hard work when you're wearing a mask. We do have a lift, but you tend not to use it. The only time I'll ever use the lift is if I've actually got lots of gear I'm carrying. But it's amazing how many times you have to run up and down the stairs. This picture was taken in Frederikshavn, which is where we've gone for the last 10 years for refit. And whilst the SDA is brand new, you really do need to go into a refit before your first season. Before any time you go south, to be honest, just to make sure that everything's working well. Oh, back to radio. So this is the radio station on the Sir David Attenborough. Oh, and you'll be delighted to know that I am actually tuned in on 20 meters there. Gosh, I must have been having a bad day. No CW. HF is all SSB. So the two sets, you've got HF MF1, so it's HF and MF, HF MF2. Telex is for 1, Telex is for 2, and then over here Inmarsat C, which it's on all the time. You receive various messages. Occasionally you get distress on it, not that often. More likely to get a GMDSS distress, which invariably is from the other side of the world. So there's not a great deal that you can do. At night, we put a curtain around here. In fact, all the desks on the bridge are curtained off because we want no light out onto the bridge to ruin the field of view. From an operating point of view, it's not really very good to be playing amateur radio. I have the Kenwood on board, and I've got a couple of antennas. I haven't done anything with it. I might try and do a temporary sort of setup whilst I'm on board in the new year. However, if I'm as busy as I have been for the last 2 work periods on board, then that's not going to happen, sadly, just because at the end of the day, I've lost all interest in everything, just want to go to my bed. Because, you know, being a new ship, there are lots of things that and we're just trying to get everything up and running and get the databases all sorted. So yeah, there's a lot that needs to be covered. So I mentioned the hangar, and this is the hangar, and it is huge. What you can't see really is, but just in here, this little area here that's boxed off, this is a moon pool, something I personally don't approve of. It's a hole right through the middle of the ship. So they can deploy using this crane here or using the CTD unit. They can deploy through the center of the ship, which means that if we're in ice, the ship's surrounded by ice, hopefully the bottom of the hole will be free. They can open up the lower door, open up the upper door, and then deploy kit through without worrying. Because ice sliding down the ship is a worry. You know, it catches on the wire, it could break the wire if it's a big enough piece of ice. There's you know, you're very restricted in your ability to do things. So yeah, this is a hangar set, which is just gigantic. But the nice thing is that you can close the garage doors, and also it does have some very good heating, which we've never used yet, but no doubt when we're south. Now, when they close the garage doors on all 3 garage doors, what they'll actually do is, if we're at sea and we're in bad weather, or well, if we're in sea and we're not doing science, they have big wooden boards, bit like sleepers, which fit into a frame, and they build up, because these garage doors will not survive being hit by the water coming over the side of the ship, and the water will come over the side of the ship. So they preempt that by building up, I think, for probably a good 1.5 meters, if not 2 meters, just to protect them. We have damaged garage doors in the past when you get sort of caught out slightly. It's just one of those things, it sort of happens. And this is just one of the many labs. This is actually a small lab. This is what we call the clean lab. So technically speaking, there's no metal in here. Obviously there is for certain bits and pieces. There's gas detectors on the back bulkhead, so that if there's anything nasty going on, it will set alarms off. There's fume hoods. And then the CTT bottles, which are these things, they've got a rack so they can bring them into here, take them off the frame, and then they're in a comfortable room to do the sampling. The drawback, because you know, when you build things, you don't always think of the consequences, and the drawback is that they've actually got to get through a weather-tight door, which can be propped open, and then through a non-weather-tight door, which currently can't be propped open, and over 2 quite high door sills. And when you're carrying that, so really you would be passing it through to people. So there are still a few little things that need to be sort of resolved, but the main lab is huge, and then there's a number of other. There's a wet lab for doing, you know, bringing up. Oh, high fog. Oh, you like high fog? I tell you what, it's quite impressive when the high fog goes off. We no wheels on the chairs. No wonder why we haven't got wheels on the chairs. Some chairs do have wheels. Funnily enough, I got a funny feeling the chairs in my office might have. Yes, I think the chairs in my office have got wheels. That rings a bell, but I haven't got any pictures of my office. So yeah, the fire suppressant system, and that is throughout the ship from the bridge all the way down to the control room. So it's what we call water mist. And basically, for those that don't know anything about water mist, it just sprays. The mist is so fine. The theory is that it's like fog. We sometimes call it high fog. The mist is so fine that it just absorbs so much of the heat. And I'm reliably informed that if it goes all over the switchgear, that's not a problem. It won't cause it all to arc out and die. Who knows? Hopefully we'll never need to use it. Can tell you an interesting story. Now, I found this one out. They had a gas suppressant system at, I don't know what the name of the company was, but some of you, if you watch Channel 4 or Channel 5, there was an outage there last month, and Channel 4 took a long while to catch up. And that's because all their programs were rebroadcast from a central hub in London, who had a fire. And it wasn't the fire that caused the damage, it was the pressure of the fire suppressant when it was released, that it rattled all the hard drives so badly that it buggered them all up, and they were completely irrecoverable. And I know this because I was visited by the BFBS engineer who was doing some work with our gear, and he knows people that work there, which I suspect will produce quite a few interesting technical papers on the approach to using pressurized gas halon. I don't use halon anymore, CO2 or whatever. But yes, the pressure definitely trashed the hard drives. However, we are not the only new kid on the block. So we are, I'm going to say this, the little ship on the right, and the big ship on the left is the Nuana. She's the Australian vessel, and she is, what are we with the end of the month? Yeah, within the next week, she's heading south. She's already south, as in she's in Hobart, but she will be heading to the Antarctic for the first time in about a week's time. The captain, this came about, she was built pretty much the same time as us. And one of the captains for the Australian Antarctic Division is an ex-British Antarctic Survey deck officer who's done very well for himself, worked his way up. And he and I were in pretty much constant communication about the building of the two ships, with just comparing things, asking questions of how are we doing this, how are they doing that. And then they were sailing and we were sort of in the vicinity, and we basically dropped hints to our respective PR departments that we could meet, and the PR departments immediately jumped onto this and contacted, you must do this. So now we had official permission. So we met up in the English Channel. They chartered an aeroplane, Flying Focus, to come out and take some very good pictures. This picture I took with our drone. And yeah, it was just really, really good to see them and to chat to them. And she is a big, big beast, is all I can say. If you go on my Twitter feed, you will see that there are links to the Antarctic, or just go on Twitter and look up AAD, Antarctic, Australian Antarctic Division. There are some very, very good video clips from within the ship. What camera do I use? Right, for all the picture, all the photos that I've done tonight, I was using a Lumix sort of bridge camera. However, I have changed. Oh, actually, was that a Lumix? No, it was a Sony bridge camera. I'm now using a Lumix SLDR. Is that right? Yeah, single lens digital reflex system. And I recently treated myself to a well, it's a 400mm lens, but because of the type of camera, it's the equivalent to an 800mm. So it does something like 200 to 800, which does take some. I've yet to use it down south, but I've taken up twitching here again. So I've got the choice of wide angle through to 800mm, which I hope will get some very, very good, very, very good pictures. It has to be said, you can't take a bad picture in the Antarctic, to be honest. My advice to anybody that's going, two things is buy the best you can afford. But I've seen people just using their iPhone getting some really, really good pictures. You know, whether you've got an expensive camera or an iPhone, you will get a picture as good as this, certainly. Wildlife will be slightly different, because certainly if you're doing seabirds or whales or whatever, you really probably want a decent lens. Never had a problem with condensation, it has to be said, and certainly not with a camera, and that primarily is because probably because we never keep it too warm inside, and if you're going ashore, it's sort of acclimatized. No, never had. I tend to have problems more with binoculars with condensation. Funnily enough, today I was having problems with condensation with my binoculars. So yeah, fast moving subjects. Penguins jumping through the water is probably one of my trickier. The hardest thing, which I'm hoping when I go south I will do a better job of, and it's without a shadow of a doubt probably my favorite bird, and that's a Wilson storm petrel, which is one of the smallest birds that you'll see in the Antarctic, and it is a true Antarctic bird. You will see it deep south. Normally, when it's blowing a hoolie, I mean, I've seen these things just skipping across the sea in a 4.7, and they're like they fly like a drunken bat, but they're the sort of the size of a bat. They're not big at all, and how they survive is just phenomenal. So that's probably my challenge if I see any of those is to get some good pictures of them. Well, will I be successful? I don't know. I do have a very bad web page, which is at GM0HCQ.com. I say it's very bad, primarily because my hard drive died on this laptop, which then meant that the software I was using for writing my web page wouldn't work, and I'm having to go to sort of more modern software, which means it's sort of all upload online, which isn't good. I much rather just upload a page where I literally just upload what I've changed, and it doesn't seem to work like that. What is living temperature on base and ship? Yeah, well, it's like, well, I mean, to be honest, living on the ship's like living in a 5-star hotel. That is the best that I can say. Cabin temperature, where you can vary. There's only 2 windows that will open on board the ship, and they're both on the bridge. That's so the captain can look out the bridge wing down the side of the ship if he wants to. Then everything else is full HVAC and aircon. We can adjust the temperature. In fact, the temperature range in my cabin, I have it turned down at night when I go to my bunk, and then I turn it up if I'm sitting in my cabin watching a film or something of an evening. And I'll wind it up to a comfortable temperature, so you can just sit there in your in a t-shirt and trousers or shorts or whatever. Food is very good. No, the food is horrendously good. I mean, I lost a lot of weight on my previous trip, primarily because I was forcing myself to just have small portions and not eat chocolate and biscuits, and because all this is available. Oh, I got an echo. Somebody put their mic on.
Yeah, that's me. I just sorry, I just jump in at this point. I'm sure people have some more questions, but I'd like to say thank you very much for a brilliant talk, and let's give Mike a round of applause.
Thank you.
I particularly love beautiful photography, and you've certainly got a lot of it in your talk, and it's been great looking at that here. So thanks for sharing it with us. It's much appreciated.